Trouble is my business too. The female fictional detective and her rise. Ever since Irene Adler beat Sherlock Holmes at his own game in A Scandal in Bohemia, women have had a complicated relationship with detectives and detective fiction. In fact, in the recent Sherlock Holmes series, Irene Adler was depicted as a dominatrix. So women have often been stereotyped in detective fiction. They can be damsels in distress, they can play victims, they can be portrayed as femme fatale figures, or they can have a rather minor background role. But a heroine? That hardly seems likely. For well over a century, they've been underestimated and dismissed. Here we have two modern detectives. The one on the right is Detective Olivia Benson. You know her from the Law and Order SVU series, an outgoing, independent, assertive, self-sufficient police officer. And on the left, that's Kathleen Turner in the film adaptation of Sarah Paretsky's Detective V.I. Warshawski. It was a bad movie, and that's why there haven't been any more adaptations. Sarah Paretsky won't sell the film rights to her books anymore. But both of these detectives can trash talk, they can kick butt. So today, the limits of detective fiction have been broadened and stretched, as we will see throughout this slideshow. Fictional female detectives actually begin in the 19th century. In the late 20s, Dorothy Sayers said there's always been a few women detectives, but on the whole, they haven't been very successful. And that's true. But these are essentially the mothers of the mystery genre. The one on the right from Catherine Crowe, that's from 1841, and an English female detective. The one on the left, that's Andrew Forster's 1864 female detective, really the first professional private eye, Miss Gladden, who works incognito. So there were some early female detectives, amateurs by and large, like the one from 1894 by Catherine Louisa Purkis, The Experiences of Loveday Brooke, the Lady Detective. Or the one from 1898 by Clarence Rook, Miss Nora Van Snoop of the New York Detective Force. Some of them had rather ridiculous names. Most of these women would have given credit to the police. They would have used their femaleness as a disguise, allowing them to go unnoticed throughout society. Let's look at two famous ones from the early 20th century, two amateur detectives who serve as prototypes in many ways. So while they have been depicted as victims or femme fatales in the majority of detective stories, some females did have central roles. And plus, there were many prominent women writers in the field. Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers, Marjorie Allingham, Nigel Marsh, just to name a few. And on the left, that's Miss Jane Marple, Agatha Christie's other famous detective, the rather nosy, old busybody, the spinster meddler, let's say, who appeared in a dozen novels from 1930 to 1971. This amateur detective who solved her mysteries in St. Mary Mead, a intelligent individual. On the right, Nancy Drew, who was invented by a man, but these books have been popular with teen girls from the beginning. There's over 130 of these adventures written over 50 years. And Nancy Drew, you can see descendants of Nancy Drew with Velma Dinkley and Scooby-Doo and Veronica Mars. There would be direct literary descendants. Just as Jessica Fletcher in Murder, She Wrote would be a kind of direct descendant of Miss Jane Marple. Now, the appeal of Nancy Drew is that she's young, she's smart, she's pretty, she's a wealthy kid, she's independent, she's got an extensive wardrobe and a car, so she's mobile. Her adventures would take place in the summer, so she wouldn't have any school to worry about. She had a couple girlfriend helpers, if you recall, Bess and George, and she even had a boyfriend, Ned, whose best trait was that he stayed out of the way. Her mother was dead, but her father, who's a lawyer, trusts her, gives her freedom, and respects her intelligence. Now, Nancy Drew leads a charmed life for a teen girl. She has power over the police. They tend to do her bidding in the books. It's a real amateur detective fantasy, but influential. However, as readers grow up and beyond Nancy Drew, who took her place? Who's the role model? Because while there's a lot of female writers, there are few female detectives, and certainly few professional private eyes in fiction, because the social range of women is rather limited before the 1960s in the West. The gender roles are rather limited. Women can be nurses, they can be teachers, they can be secretaries, like Effie in Dashiell Hammett's Sam Spade book, The Maltese Falcon. But a woman as a private investigator or a police officer, that's rather far-fetched. It would be at odds with traditional gender roles and expectations for women from the 30s to the 60s. And you have to keep in mind that detective fiction tends to reflect the prevailing social conditions. So it would be hard to suspend disbelief in the audience at a female detective that would have been a professional at this point. What an audience can imagine is a woman as a partner. We get the sidekicks in the 1930s. On the left, that's Nick and Nora Charles from Dashiell Hammett's 1934 novel The Thin Man, which was actually made into about 6 films. That's William Powell and Myrna Loy and Asta the Terrier. The first movie is the best. You can go on YouTube and see all the Thin Man witty lines. But this couple was sort of hard drinking, wisecracking. They were New York City socialites. They were not so much mysteries as they were light comedy of manners, sort of the model for TV's moonlighting in the 1980s. Lots of banter between the two here. I'll give you an example. Nora says to her husband at one point, "I read where you were shot 5 times in the tabloids." And Nick replies, "Not true. He didn't come anywhere near my tabloids." So you get a bit of sexual innuendo there. Funny, amusing story. On the right, that's Dorothy L. Sayers, famous detective Lord Peter Wimsey, and he's married to Harriet Vane, and she really plays second banana to him. She's his helpmate, primarily because she's got 3 sons to look after. But we see these kind of sidekicks, these females, as a helper to the male lead, let's say. You even see that later in the 90s with the X-Files, if you recall, Dana Scully, the FBI agent, who's a scientist working with Mulder. An interesting shift happens in the 1940s, though, that is worth mentioning. In 1946, Dorothy Sayers wrote an essay called The Art of the Mystery Story, where she was critiquing female detectives. And she concludes that women are more believable as amateurs, which is really interesting at this point, the mid-40s. On the right is Sam Merwin's Amy Brewster mysteries. There were 3 of these written in the 1940s, and they had a real novelty factor because Amy Brewster weighed about 300 pounds. She was this middle-aged, short, fat, gray-haired woman who had stained and shapeless clothes, who burped a lot, and had very few social skills. She was extremely unfeminine, but intelligent. And on the left, A.A. Fair's Bertha Cool and Donnie Lamb murder mysteries. And Earl Stanley Gardner is the pen name for A.A. Fair, or the real name for A.A. Fair, excuse me. He also created Perry Mason, that famous detective. And what was interesting about Bertha Cool is that she was another huge woman, about 240 pounds, a woman who chain smoked, had a dirty mouth, There were about a dozen of these books. And she reminds me of Detective Anna Halsey from Raymond Chandler's short story, Trouble Is My Business. This rather rotund, greedy, unethical, irritable, penny-pinching, hard-boiled detective. Very unsentimental. Bertha Cool doesn't really have a weakness for whiskey. Her weakness are pies. Yeah, really interesting depictions, rather extreme portraits of female detectives, caricatures, these rather bizarre, grotesque depictions of female detectives. Here's another example of these sort of dragon ladies, these monstrous detectives depicted throughout the mid 20th century. Gladys Mitchell, this detective series, 66 novels from 1929 to 1975. And she's beastly. She's described in reptilian terms. She's called a deadly serpent, an alligator, a hag-like pterodactyl, a boa constrictor, and her nickname is Mrs. Crocodile. Kind of elderly, but intelligent and dangerous. So I'm not sure these are really believable characters. They have some business savvy. They're hard boiled, but they certainly do not have a lot of redeeming qualities. Now, at the same time as those rather monstrous dragon lady fictional female detectives were being created, there's another strain running through detective fiction in the 1940s, primarily because of the war. And a lot of these books were written for teen girls. The audience for Nancy Drew was huge, and these books were written from the 40s to the 60s, similar in a way to Trixie Beldam, the girl detective, these amateurs. On the right is Cherry Ames, who was an Army nurse in the Army Corps, but also an amateur detective. And they're essentially war propaganda. You know, these books would have encouraged women to be nurses, to help the war effort in any way they could. And Cherry Ames was a single woman, but they certainly show that, you know, women can succeed in public, in the workplace, and do various jobs. On the left, the Vicky Barr stories, written by Helen Wells from the 1940s to the 1960s. She was a stewardess, as the series says, and an amateur detective as well, who would often solve the mysteries on board the plane with some rather suspicious passengers. Titles like Peril Over the Airport or The Mystery of Flight 908. So, slightly different than the monstrous, beastly detectives, but still rather stereotypical professions. Nurses, stewardesses, kind of fantasies. What happens in the 1950s? Well, we get the bombshell detective happening here. On the right, Carter Brown wrote a series of Mavis Sedlitz mysteries from the late 50s to the early 70s. I think there was about a dozen of these books. Blurbs on the jackets would have said things like this: "She plays hard and fast with men, money, and murder." I'm sure she does. She would have been described as the ditzy darling of the detective set. Kind of a dumb blonde figure, let's say. A female detective whose physical assets would have outweighed her mental ones. Often in the middle of a case, her bra straps would be breaking. She would be losing the tight clothes she would have worn. She would be depicted in peekaboo blouses and see-through nighties more often than not. And she would have worked for a guy named Johnny Rios, who ran a detective agency. On the left, Honey West. These are famous books, although now largely forgotten. Created in the late 50s, two writers, a husband and wife team, Gigi Fichtling. The husband was a sports writer and the wife was a fashion writer. They created, as it says on the page there, the nerviest, curvest private detective in LA. Sure she is. Kind of a Marilyn Monroe look-alike, essentially. Honey West inherits a detective agency from her father. She has a sidekick, Johnny Doom. What a great name. And Johnny Doom is often saying lines like this to Honey: Honey, where's your clothes? Yeah. So they're kind of comic. It was actually turned into a TV show for 1 year in the mid 60s, but didn't last long. So here these two depictions show us quite a change from, again, these rather traditional roles of nurses and stewardesses and teachers and things like that, or these monstrous, beastly ones from the 40s. Now we've got the detective as a sex object, quite different, but still largely a caricature, a kind of male fantasy, the ditzy bimbos. However, they're not amateurs. They're now private detectives, so perhaps that's a little bit of a step forward. By the time we get to the 60s in Western culture, we can see perhaps more social confusion over gender roles. Women are certainly gaining more independence in the culture. They're getting more educated, getting different jobs. They're more liberated, competent, ambitious. They're kind of breaking out of those domestic bounds of marriage and family, of being a wife and a mother. And even on the other end, the femme fatale figure represents, I think, some anxiety and fears about professional women who are strong and intelligent. So if we look up until the 1960s, a fictional female detective could be unmarried. If she was going to be married, she was always the second banana. She was usually childless. She could be old, like Miss Marple, or a teenager, like Nancy Drew. She could be ugly, or she could be beautiful. And those were pretty much the choices until the 1960s. And then Amanda Cross comes along, an academic, and she really lays the groundwork for later fictional female detectives. She creates a fictional detective called Kate Fansler, who is an English professor at a New York City university. She's in her late 30s, early 40s, an amateur detective, but a professional woman in academia, a scholar. And it's a great overlap because scholars have investigative training, they know how to conduct research, they know how to make use of reason and logic in search of the truth, and they work in this closed society of a university. So these were quite influential texts throughout the 60s and the 70s. Now, the feminist detective begins to take off in the 60s and 70s. We've come a long way from Raymond Chandler's Simple Art of Murder essay when he describes what a detective should be, and you'll notice he uses a lot of masculine pronouns, describing the detective as he and man. So, to create a female fictional detective required a total reworking of the genre's conventions. And that's really what P.D. James' title of her first Cordelia Gray mystery suggests. An unsuitable job for a woman would be a professional private eye. So we've gone from Amanda Cross's amateur detective there working in academia. Now we have a woman working at a business as a professional private eye. So Cordelia Gray is a young woman who inherits a detective agency. I believe the owner commits suicide. She was the secretary typist and really becomes promoted to the private detective. She doesn't have any parents. She's solitary, but she becomes quickly self-sufficient and professional as she learns the ropes. So P.D. James' book from, I think, 1972, set in London. It really is a remarkable and influential text for female fictional detectives. On the other side of the pond in America, Marcia Muller creates an American fictional private eye who's on staff at the All Souls Cooperative, which is a legal services firm in San Francisco. She's in her late 20s, Sharon McCone, and she features in about 30 odd books from the late 70s forward. They're kind of soft-boiled, I would say, mildly feminist. There's a bit of a romance plot weaved into them. McCone has a bit of a relationship with a police officer. As a detective, McCone is rather pragmatic and focused, a bit of a brooder and a thinker. But you certainly see more domestic, personal issues dominating the text as they progress. And what's happening in the 70s are female detectives in fiction and in TV are growing and becoming a bit more realistic, again, mirroring what's going on in society. We see Angie Dickinson in 1974 appearing on TV as Pepper Anderson in Police Woman. Um, you get Cagney and Lacey in the early 80s, those two police officers on TV. I mean, even Charlie's Angels, even though they're private eyes and fashion models that kind of harken back to the bombshell detectives of the 50s, are slowly sort of moving forward. But I would say the TV show Hill Street Blues from the early 80s is another one with police officers on the workforce who are women and have partners who are male, and women who are lawyers and things like that. So you can see things starting to shift throughout the 70s. There's Sarah Paretsky, the author we'll be looking at. Did you know she has a PhD in history? Yeah, very smart woman. Feminist, activist. She was named Woman of the Year in 1987 by Ms. Magazine. She creates the famous V.I. Warshawski, Private Detective, in 1982 with Indemnity Only. Now, let's look at this before we get to the 80s. From 1860 to 1985, in a stretch of 125 years, about 70 female fictional detectives are created. Okay. But then, from 1985 to 1995, just 10 years, there are another 70 female fictional detectives created. What a huge leap. So we can see the rise of sort of feminist crime novels and strong female leads throughout the murder mystery genre. And it's really totally remapping the landscape of fictional detectives and private eyes. So it really begins with Sarah Paretsky in a lot of ways. And in the 80s, she said that at the beginning, she was trying to create a character who was actually mimicking the Chandler tradition, only in female form, kind of a Marlowe in drag. And she said what she really wanted was a woman who was trying to make a success in a field traditionally dominated by men. And that's V.I. Warshawski. Vic. And she, with VI, she says, with men, it always seems as though I'm having to fight to maintain who I am. Yeah. So in the Paretsky books, there were a lot of gender reversals. You don't see femme fatales in Paretsky's books. You see a lot of dangerous men. So she's challenging stereotypes. And her plots tend to focus around social oppression of women and female status. There's issues of child sexual abuse, crime, corruption, and big business, the Catholic Church, the Mafia, three organizations I think that Paretsky feels that exploit and victimize women. And yes, VI is hard-boiled, but she gets beaten up, kidnapped, and threatened with guns just as much as Marlowe does in a lot of ways. Here's the other famous one from the 1980s. Sue Grafton was a screenplay writer of TV and film, and she created the Kinsey Malone murder mysteries. She's worked her way through the alphabet, A to Z. And Sue Grafton has said, I'm a feminist from way back. And she said she chose the classic private eye genre because she liked playing hardball with the boys. Good for her. Kinsey Malone, very similar to V.I. Warshawski. She might have to seduce a suspect. She might even have to kill him if push comes to shove. Another young private detective in her mid-30s, a former police officer who quit because of the corruption in the force, similar to Marlowe with his insubordination in the DA's office. Kinsey Malone's divorced, doesn't have any children, doesn't have any parents, a kind of solitary woman who says, I just like my life as it is. Although she's not a good cook, and she tends to eat more junk food than she really should, which is why she ends up jogging a lot as well. And she curses a lot too. There's not a lot of romance in the Sarah Paretsky and Sue Grafton novels, but what's interesting is that these two fictional private eyes have a lot of sexual relationships with men, just not long-term relationships because they're more of a threat to their independence, let's say. So those two hard-boiled detectives work in a violent world. The mean streets, just like Marlowe, they encounter danger, they endure violence, they confront criminals, they have to subdue suspects with their wits, but sometimes with their fists and their guns as well. And they've got vices too. They smoke, they drink, they swear. And they're modern women having a variety of relationships, and they're worrying about their appearance sometimes. And they're quite fascinating first person narratives, quite intimate, reminiscent of Hamnet and Chandler's style, very bare and direct. And what I like about Grafton and Paretsky's books is that they're a bit self-reflexive. They comment on the genre, on the writers, and the tropes of detective fiction. And their message is, I would say, feminist. They show how women won't defer to male authority, how women can use language as power just as effectively as men. And readers like these stories. They get to live vicariously through these two strong female leads. So I would say that Sarah Paretsky and Sue Grafton have certainly extended the boundaries of female detective fiction over the last 30 years. But they're not the only ones who've done that. The American writer Patricia Cornwell created Dr. Kay Carspada, who is a medical examiner, forensic scientist who works in Virginia. And that book on the right there is the first one in the series, Postmortem, about a serial killer. It won all kinds of awards, although she was only paid in advance of $7,500 for it. Not a lot, but a highly influential series. I think there's about 20 of these stories, and they would have influenced shows like CSI, Cold Case, Bones, The Closer, those kind of things. Her second novel, Body of Evidence, because the first one was such a huge bestseller, she was paid about $400,000 for. So they would have influenced things like the picture on the left there, Jane Tennyson, the detective inspector of Scotland Yard, the British police procedural you may have seen on TV. So these also extended the boundaries of female fictional detectives. Another interesting sort of subgenre of female fictional detectives is the ABC detective, the American-born Chinese. So you can see not only are we imagining women as professional private eyes or on the police force or forensics, medical examiners, we can even imagine them as being ethnic. Lydia Chin is a private detective working in New York City, primarily Chinatown, a rather petite, attractive woman who carries a gun and knows martial arts. There's about a dozen of these books, been very well received, very popular. So we can see the female fictional detective not only growing in various professions, but even in various parts of the globe. The fictional female detective knows no geographic boundaries. Amy Leduc's mysteries are set in modern Paris. There's about 13 of these books. If you're a fan of Georges Simenon's Detective Magritte stories, you might like these. Amy Leduc works with a dwarf, and these stories really focus on computer forensics and corporate security, very modern in their outlook, and they've won awards. And Amy Leduc is a modern woman, but she likes a retro look. She's willing to wear Chanel dresses and Christian Dior. She's got high heels, but she's just as tough as the guys. Here's another example of how the geographic boundaries are being extended. This series of novels from 1992 to 2014, I believe, about 20 of them, are set primarily in Alaska, Anchorage. Detective Kate Shagok is a native Alaskan and a Aleut. Her partner is a dog, a husky. Yeah. And she, I believe, is a district attorney in Alaska, solving various mysteries. These famous ones from Scottish writer Alexander McCall Smith are set in Botswana. That's Precious Ramotse. Jill Scott there, the actress, is playing her in a recent TV series. I think there's about 14 books in the series. Very character driven, really about the rural community in Botswana. Slightly comic, but certainly with a mystery surrounding it all. And what we have here is a woman in Africa in a non-traditional role and occupation, becoming a private eye. Last two examples here from, again, South Africa and even Australia. On the left, that's Detective Jade de Jong Mysteries. There's about four of these books, and they're set in Johannesburg post-apartheid. And on the right, kind of a retro series, a historical novel about Fryn Fisher, who's a wealthy aristocrat in the late 20s, 1930s, who lives in Melbourne and drives a car and flies a plane. She was a nurse in World War I, and they were turned into a TV show. And they kind of remind me of Jacqueline Winspar's series, Maisie Dobbs. And these books are also set in the 20s and 30s in post-World War London. And Maisie Dobbs is a psychologist, sort of amateur detective. So again, pushing the boundaries geographically, professionally, and sort of including various different types of women in different places into the genre. We'll give the last words to Denise Mena. She's a Scottish mystery writer, part of the Tartan Noir movement, and she created a detective, Patricia Meehan, who is a Glasgow journalist. And by the time we get to today, these writers are pointing out that it really doesn't matter if your detective is a woman anymore. That's not a superpower like it might have been. It's just a fact about who you are. So there's been quite an evolution in the last 170 odd years, and especially since the 1980s, because there's been well over 200 new mystery series by women, mostly with female leads, and they can either be amateurs, private eyes, or in the police force. So you don't really have any trouble finding mystery books with female detectives anymore. So those voices in the margins have moved to the center of mainstream North American culture, and they've gone global. So the stories are varied in how they show female detectives, their relations to crime and law and justice, morality, knowledge, power, and yes, men. And they've got varied themes too. There's really no more consistent model. But I would say they're worthy successors to Miss Marple, Nancy Drew, and those hard-boiled detectives of the 30s like Sam Spade and Philip Marlowe. So these modern fictional female detectives are not dependent on men. They're complex, they're independent, they're intelligent and tough. They're outgoing and self-sufficient. And what we'll notice is how they transcend the generic codes, how they try to rewrite the archetypal male detective from Sherlock Holmes and Dupin through Spade and Marlowe and up to the modern day. Hope you enjoyed the show.